Welcome to Milsurp Minutes. I'm Nick. Today we're going to be taking a look at an interesting American rifle of the Second World War, and that's the M1903A3 Springfield rifle. These rifles would have been made by the Remington Company and the Smith Corona Typewriter Company, and I'll get into the production numbers later in the video. But for right now we're going to cover a little bit of the history of this rifle, how it came to be, how it got used, and things like that. So the 1903A3 would be derived from the 1903 modified, and then that in turn came from the 1903 Springfield rifles that were made by Remington, the initial run of them in late 1941 into 1942. By the time World War II had started, the 1903 was largely being phased out, with the M1 Garand coming online and getting issued out to troops on frontline troops. 1903 Springfields did get to see action with the Marine Corps early in the war, and some with the Army, but mostly Marine Corps. The Marines still like the accuracy of the 1903, but the last big hurrah of the 1903 in large numbers would have been Guadalcanal and engagements like that in late 1942. The 03A3 specifically would have entered production late in 1942, with the bulk of them being made in 1943 and into 1944. Another thing to note is that the 1903A4 sniper rifle would be based off of the 1903A3 rifle. So, what made this rifle different from the original? The big thing was that when Remington started making 1903s, they were built off of the old Rock Island tooling. And in a future video, when I get my hands on a true 1903 Springfield, I will discuss the history of the rifle a little bit more as it was originally, but this is mostly going to focus on Second World War production rifles. Gradually into 1942, Remington would start to introduce more simplified components for the original configuration 1903s, like stamped barrel bands and stamped sling swivels, like that. And eventually, late in 42, they would start production of they and Smith Corona would start production of the 1903A3. The biggest difference between the 03 and the 03A3 would be moving the rear sight from in front of the receiver, at the spot which is now handguard, to the back of the receiver, in a similar manner to how the rear sight was relocated on the No. 4 Mark I Lee Enfield rifle used by the British during the Second World War, as opposed to the World War I configuration of the No. 1 Mark III. To discuss the production numbers of the rifles. When Remington got the contract, their serial number would start at rifle number 3 million, and that would include the rifles that I mentioned that were originally just built to the World War I standard off of the Rock Island tooling. That would also include 1903 simplified rifles, or modified rifles, and that would include 03A3s. And by the time it was all said and done, they made roughly a little over 1 million rifles, give or take. Of that, 345,000 of these rifles were 1903 modified rifles, and then 711,276 rifles were 1903A3s. And then there was an additional 26,653 1903A4s. Only Remington would make 1903A4s. The receivers would be stamped differently, and if I ever get the chance to look at one, it's going to appear on the channel. They're pretty cool. Like I mentioned, there were 26,000 made as compared to 710,000. So there's considerably less sniper rifles as it normally goes. Smith Corona had a fairly small, relatively small batch. Smith Corona would only make 234,000 rifles, so around a little less than a quarter of all 03A3s would be made by Smith Corona, which this is a Smith Corona rifle. However, when I get into it later, when I go butt plate to muzzle, I'll show you what parts are correct and which parts are not correct. On this one, most of them aren't correct because this was a sporterized rifle that I desporterized, and most of the parts are Remington. One thing that's very interesting that I don't see discussed too often about the Smith Corona rifles, though, is that when they started up production, and to my knowledge, throughout the entire production run, they sourced their barrels from High Standard, who at the time were making, the two things I know they were making is they were making replacement barrels for 1911s, and they were making M2 Browning machine guns, just the whole guns. But they also made the barrels that Smith Corona used for the 1903 rifles. Well, when they first started up production, High Standard had 5,000 30-06 barrel blanks with 6-groove rifling cut into them. Smith Corona then bought those 5,000 barrel blanks, had them made into 03A3 barrels, and made them to rifles. Another important thing to mention is the normal groove configuration for a 1903A3 Springfield will be 2 grooves. I know World War I configuration 03A3s, I believe, are 4-groove barrels. But back to the point. Normally 2-groove. Smith Corona bought 5,000 6-groove barrels. And I had been under the impression that those 6-groove barrels would have been on the first 5,000 rifles. Smith Corona, their production started at serial number 3.08 million, I believe. If I'm not mistaken, something roughly like that. If I'm wrong, I'll put it in on the screen right now. And I would have assumed that it's the first 5,000. This rifle was made about almost 50,000 serial numbers into the production run of the total that they would make. This one has a 6-groove barrel. The receiver serial number matches a rough date of the date stamped on the barrel. What I believe is the cause of this is that I think the barrel wasn't quite up to snuff when they first got it and made it into an 03 Springfield barrel, and it kept getting cycled through until they eventually got it up to spec. They worked it right. They put it on a receiver, and they built it as a complete gun and shipped it out on the military contract. It's a little bit perplexing. I know that the 6-groove barrels, if you get really deep into 1903s, can be worth quite a bit. But as I said, this thing has barely any correct parts on it. And I'm going to bring you guys in a little bit closer, and I'm going to show you that, and I'm going to show you a few of the features about this rifle to make it kind of interesting. So, going from butt plate to muzzle, let's see if I can get this at an angle where you can see it. This butt plate is actually kind of interesting. As I said, I just gathered a bunch of 03 parts to put this thing together. This butt plate actually predates the 03A3 by a good couple of decades. The flat butt plates like these you would see on like late 1900s and early 1910s Springfield rifles, Springfield and Rock Island. And if I'm not mistaken, I don't know if this one necessarily is, but some butt plates like this were reworked Krag butt plates, and I guess that was like the one interchangeable part between the Krag Jorgensen 96 and 92 and the Springfield rifle. But I'll show you pictures of what different 03 Springfield butt plates look like here, as well as 03A3 butt plates. And there's a good number of variations to them, and I can't get into every single detail of them right now, but I'll try to cover it here on screen. Moving forward, another part that was changed from the 03 to the 03A3 is the stamped sling swivel retainer, or piece right there. Another thing that would be changed would be going from a milled floor plate and trigger assembly piece to a singular stamped one. And this is a Remington one, and you can tell it. I'll show you on screen here. The stamp, you can really tell it with the stamping right here. Smith Coronas look dramatically different. As far as I can tell, the only parts that are original Smith Corona to this rifle are the receiver, the barrel, the bolt body, and I think the rear sight. I didn't replace the cocking piece here, but it does have an R stamp that I'll show you up close here that identifies it as a Remington cocking piece. As I said, it is a Smith Corona bolt with an X stamped on the top of the bolt handle. And I'll show you closer up. US Smith Corona model 03A3, followed by the serial number. Moving to the other side of the receiver. you can see the magazine disconnect, which also acts as the bolt release, which in a couple of minutes I'm going to show you how that works and what's kind of neat about that. It also has the gas relief hole, which this is my only sample size of 1903A3 rifle, but I'm to understand that later produced rifles, they would delete this and would just have another way of venting gas off in the event of a ruptured case. You have the full length upper handguard as opposed to the partial one that you would have originally had with the rear sight mounted there originally. You have stamped sling swivels and barrel bands, unlike milled ones from earlier. Same with a stamped stacking swivel. These are all stamped with an R, identifying them as Remington. Stamped nose cap. Similar, basically the same front sight base to the 03 Springfield, the original style one, with that fine front sight. Now I'm going to show you guys how the magazine disconnect works here, and I'll just reposition the camera for you. So, as I mentioned, this rifle does have a magazine cutoff switch. The way I see it is the reason why they probably kept the magazine cutoff switch is this is also used to retain the bolt. So here it's off, that means the magazine is disengaged. If you flip the switch to the middle position, that is your bolt removal position. And if you flip it up to on, that activates the bolt. What it does is this switch makes it so that when you open the bolt, when it's switched off, the bolt doesn't come back far enough to pick up a cartridge in the magazine. It also doesn't come back far enough for you to put a stripper clip into or to load it with a stripper clip. The doctrine behind this had largely been abandoned by World War I, which was you load your magazine, you switch it on, load your magazine, load around in the chamber, and then switch it off. And the idea is that you single load rounds until you find yourself in an emergency situation where you need to engage targets faster. This was seen as a pretty pointless feature, and it was definitely not in use by the Second World War. But to show you how it works, I'm going to close it, switch it on, open it up, and I have a Second World War era dummy cartridge here. You can tell by those big crimps in the side of it. I'm just going to load it in, get the bolt clear of it, switch the magazine off. Now, I throw the bolt open, the round doesn't present. But if I switch it off again, it'll chamber the round and eject it. And then bolt will lock open on an empty magazine with this rifle. And that's how a brief look at the magazine disconnect system on this rifle. So this has been a brief overlook of the 1903A3 Springfield rifle. This was really kind of the last hurrah of bolt-action rifles in U.S. military service as a infantry small arm. And after this rifle was introduced, these still really didn't see a whole lot of action. It's difficult finding pictures of them in use in theater. Not to say that they weren't used at all. And they even served in some respect into the Korean War. But by the time these things had come around, M1 Garand production had largely caught up to what the military needed. But this acted as a good, fairly simple to produce rifle, able to be just put into the hands of troops quickly if the supply of M1 Garands just wasn't what it needed to be. Ultimately, that wasn't the case. And these rifles were kind of forgotten and kind of obsolete by the time they entered service. But that's just a brief overlook of the 1903 Springfield, the last of the American bolt-action combat rifles. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.